February 24th, 1978. A cold winter evening settled over Northern California, painting the streets and rooftops in shades of frost and shadow. In the town of Chico, a small city tucked into the Sacramento Valley, 5 young men were leaving the local gymnasium. Their night had been ordinary, or so it seemed. Jack Madruga, Jackie Hewitt, Ted Weir, Gary Mathias, and Bill Sterling. 5 names that, just hours later, would become etched into one of the most baffling mysteries in American history. They were not thrill-seekers, not adventurers seeking danger. They were ordinary college students and recent graduates, very young with lives that reflected the quiet rhythm of responsibility and routine. They had jobs, families who cared deeply for them, and futures that seemed bright, filled with the small ambitions and hopes of young adults in the late 1970s. Jack Madruga, 30 years old, was athletic, the kind of young man who carried himself with quiet confidence. His friends often looked to him for direction, trusting his judgment and relying on his steady presence. Jackie Hewitt, 24 years old, was the joker of the group, a natural storyteller whose humor could lighten even the tensest moments. Ted Weir, 32 years old, brought balance, quiet and thoughtful, a reliable counterpoint to the other's energy. Gary Mathias, 25 years old, very young and the most vulnerable, had developmental challenges that made him especially dependent on the support and guidance of his friends. And Bill Sterling, 29 years old, reserved yet kind, was the one who often put others' needs ahead of his own. Together they formed a tight-knit group, bonded by friendship and shared routines, their personalities complementing one another like pieces of a puzzle. That night, the 5 of them had attended a basketball game in Chico, a routine evening of fun, laughter, and camaraderie. The stands had been filled with cheering fans, the squeak of sneakers on polished gym floors, and the rhythmic bounce of the basketball echoing against the walls. For a few hours, they were simply young men enjoying a night out, leaving behind the pressures of study, work, and the slow march of adult responsibility. When the final whistle blew, signaling the end of the game, they gathered their coats, said their goodbyes, and walked toward their car, a white Mercury Marquis, dependable and unassuming, the vehicle that would carry them into the night. No one anticipated that this drive would mark the beginning of a mystery that would puzzle families, friends, and authorities for decades. They were seen leaving the parking lot by other attendees, waving, smiling, chatting casually among themselves. No one noticed anything out of the ordinary, no tension, no hint of urgency, no sign that these ordinary young men were about to vanish without a trace. They drove off into the cold night, headlights cutting through the darkness, and disappeared from sight like shadows melting into the mountains. By the time anyone would realize that something was wrong, the world had already begun to conspire against them. The first worry came hours later, as the evening stretched into the night and into early morning. Families expected phone calls. The men were never late without reason. But now, one by one, family members began to sense that something was wrong. It began with small things, a missed call here, a failure to return home there. But soon, the concern turned into alarm. Bill Sterling's mother tried to reach him, calling the local dormitories and friends. Ted Weir's family wondered if he had been delayed by something minor, perhaps stuck in traffic or helping a friend. Gary Mathias's parents worried more intensely. Gary had always relied on the guidance of his peers, and the idea of him traveling alone on icy roads at night seemed dangerous. By morning, the first official reports were being filed. The White Mercury had not returned, and the 5 men were nowhere to be found. It was unusual, bizarre even, for young men with no history of recklessness to vanish without explanation. Who had seen them last? What was the timeline of their disappearance? These questions quickly became the first threads in a knot of mystery that refused to unravel. Witnesses would later recall seeing the car parked briefly along the highway on the outskirts of town, headlights briefly cutting through fog and shadow. Beyond that, there were only glimpses, passing drivers, distant lights reflecting off wet pavement, but no confirmed sightings, and then silence. The initial shock rippled through the Chico community. Friends, neighbors, and family members could not reconcile the idea that these mild-mannered, responsible young men could simply vanish into rural Northern California. The area surrounding Yuba County, where they were later thought to have traveled, was vast and rugged, dotted with forests, hills, and rivers. Snow had already begun to dust the foothills, and the terrain itself could become treacherous without warning. The environment seemed almost to conspire with the mystery, a winter landscape capable of swallowing the unwary, an expanse so large and uncharted that a car could disappear, and 5 people with it, without leaving a clear trace. Authorities were called, search parties were formed, but the initial sweep yielded little. The roads were quiet, the forests undisturbed. There was no accident, no sign of struggle, no evidence to suggest foul play, or to confirm that the men had ventured far from the beaten path. The very ordinary nature of these young men, their careful habits and predictability, made their disappearance even more perplexing. How could such measured, cautious individuals vanish in a matter of hours? Speculation began almost immediately. Perhaps they had decided on a spontaneous adventure, taking a wrong turn and becoming lost in the Sierra foothills. Perhaps an accident had occurred, the car sliding off a road or into a ravine where it might remain hidden for days or weeks. Or some whispered, was there something darker at play? Could someone have taken them? Could a malicious force have intervened in a night that had begun so unremarkably? For families, the questions were unbearable. For investigators, the puzzle was confounding. And for the community at large, the idea that 5 young men, ordinary in every way, could vanish into the night remained almost impossible to comprehend. Yet, as the hours stretched into days, the reality became undeniable. Jack, Jackie, Ted, Gary, and Bill were missing, and no one knew why or how they had disappeared into the dark, cold expanse of Northern California. And so begins the story of the Yuba County Five, 5 young men whose ordinary lives collided with a night of mystery and misfortune, a disappearance that would haunt a community, confound authorities, and remain unsolved for decades. A night when 5 friends left a basketball game, and the world would never see them as they once were again. The morning after the 5 men failed to return home, the first calls came in. Families, sensing that something was wrong, contacted local authorities. Anxiety hung heavy in the air. Jack's mother called the Chico police station, her voice tight with worry, asking if anyone had seen her son. Ted's father drove nervously around town, checking dormitories and acquaintances, each unanswered phone call amplifying his fear. Gary's parents, acutely aware of his reliance on the group, felt a deep unease settle in their chests. Bill's family waited in vain, hoping for a simple explanation. By mid-morning, law enforcement had begun to mobilize. Officers canvassed the neighborhoods, questioning anyone who might have seen the men or their vehicle. Local residents, friends, and neighbors quickly joined the effort, forming informal search parties to comb the streets and nearby rural roads. Yet the terrain of Northern California's Sierra Nevada foothills proved unforgiving. Rolling hills, dense forests, and winding roads complicated the search. Snow dusted the roads and the surrounding woodland, masking tracks and footprints almost as soon as they were made. Each turn seemed to reveal another dead end, another question with no answer. It was during these initial searches that the first strange clues appeared. Footprints, some solitary, some in small clusters, were discovered along paths that didn't connect logically. Some ended abruptly at steep embankments, as though whoever made them had vanished into thin air. Then came the Mercury Marquis. Found by a passing motorist on a remote mountain road near Yuba County, the car sat abandoned, its engine cold, no one inside. It was pristine on the outside, yet the vehicle's abandonment raised more questions than it answered. Personal items, jackets, a wallet, a notebook, lay scattered inside, untouched, suggesting that the men had not left in a rush. The air around the car seemed almost surreal, an eerie stillness that hinted at something deeply amiss. Residents of nearby towns began speculating. Some whispered that the men had been victims of foul play. Others thought perhaps they had simply become lost in the wilderness. Rumors swirled, growing louder with each passing day, as local businesses and diners became makeshift hubs for updates and theories. 5 young men gone, the headlines would read, though no answers had yet surfaced. Community tension grew, a mix of fear, curiosity, and frustration settling like a shadow over the region. Among the few who might have glimpsed something unusual that night was a man whose own car had become stuck near the remote road where the mercury was later discovered. Alone and already under stress, he suffered a mild heart attack in the cold, snowy night. Though he survived, the incident added a layer of confusion to the evening's events. He would later tell investigators he had seen lights moving across the hills, though he couldn't identify whether they were from cars, flashlights, or the van itself. His testimony would become one of the few ambiguous accounts from that night. Another possible witness recalled hearing voices late in the evening, echoing faintly through the forests near Marysville Ridge. At first, it seemed like the ordinary sounds of nature, branches snapping, distant animals moving through the snow. But something about the pattern of calls and responses made him uneasy. Could it have been the young men, separated from their car, wandering through the darkness, or something else entirely? Like so much else in this case, the account remained inconclusive, tantalizing investigators without providing clarity. Police expanded the search to include helicopters, roadblocks, and detailed grid sweeps across the forested regions. Families assisted where they could, calling in friends, neighbors, anyone who might help locate the missing men. Yet even with dozens of volunteers and law enforcement combing the area, the 5 men seemed to have vanished without a trace. The local sheriff later described the early search as like looking for ghosts in the mountains. The terrain was deceptive. Shallow ravines, snow-covered gullies, and forest paths that twisted back on themselves. Every clue seemed to vanish almost as quickly as it appeared. Footprints that could have led to answers disappeared in the next snowfall. Items left near the abandoned car were quickly buried in drifting snow. Even the most careful investigators struggled to map a path, to imagine what the men might have experienced that night. Meanwhile, the community's speculation became almost as tangible as the search itself. Diner conversations, gas station gossip, and whispered theories painted a picture of fear and fascination. Some believed the men had simply lost their way. Others imagined darker scenarios, kidnapping, foul play, or something more sinister, lurking in the remote wilderness. Each theory reflected the collective anxiety of a small town grappling with an inexplicable disappearance. Authorities, too, faced pressure. The public demanded answers, and the media began following the case closely, reporting every minor development. Yet despite days of searching, despite the involvement of multiple agencies, no definitive clues were uncovered. No bodies, no evidence, no confirmation of foul play or accident. It was as if the young men had been swallowed by the night itself, leaving only a car, a few scattered items, and a growing sense of unease. By the end of the first week, it became clear that this would not be a straightforward missing person case. The abandoned Mercury, the footprints in the snow, the faint testimonies of witnesses, all were fragments of a story that refused to come together. Investigators began to document every detail meticulously, yet each report seemed only to deepen the mystery. Why had these 5 responsible, careful young men vanished so completely? How had they ended up in such a remote and hazardous environment? Even as the search intensified, the sense of urgency was tempered by the realization of how treacherous the landscape truly was. Volunteers moved cautiously, aware that the mountains themselves were as much a danger as the unknown circumstances of the men's disappearance. Rescue dogs tracked scents that vanished in the cold air. Helicopters scoured ridgelines that quickly faded into mist and shadow. Every effort was made, yet every clue seemed to lead to dead ends. And so, the Yuba County Five, 5 ordinary young men with ordinary lives, remained missing. Their disappearance had shaken a community, perplexed law enforcement, and captured the imagination of anyone who heard the story. In those early days, before bodies were found, before theories took hold, the case existed in a liminal space between hope and horror, a space filled with unanswered questions, strange sightings, and the cold, indifferent expanse of Northern California's Sierra Nevada foothills. When searchers first stumbled upon the abandoned white Mercury marquee in the Sierra Nevada mountains, it immediately became the centerpiece of the mystery. There it was, sitting silently on a remote mountain road, miles from anywhere the 5 young men were expected to be. The car wasn't damaged. There were no dents, no broken headlights, no scratches down the side that might have indicated it had been forced off the road. It wasn't stuck in snow or mud either. The tires were in good condition, the engine capable of running, and inside, the gas gauge showed at least a quarter of a tank remaining. Most chilling of all, one of the car windows had been rolled down. In freezing winter temperatures, that detail alone felt wrong. Who would leave a window open in a mountain night, with snow in the air and icy winds sweeping through the valleys? Inside the Mercury, personal belongings remained scattered but intact. Maps, wallets with cash, even folded jackets that could have provided warmth. Nothing suggested a struggle. There was no sign of blood, no broken glass, no evidence that someone had tried to force their way in or out. It was as if the 5 men had simply decided to step out and never returned. Investigators and family members were stunned. The Mercury was in working order. All they had to do was turn the key, roll up the window, and drive back down into Chico. Instead, they left the car on an isolated mountain road where snow was already beginning to fall. Why? Some pointed immediately to Gary Mathias, the youngest of the group. Gary had been managing a mental disability, paranoid schizophrenia, that sometimes caused erratic decision-making. Could Gary have convinced the others to follow him deeper into the mountains, away from the safety of the car? His condition made him more vulnerable, but his friends were deeply loyal. They wouldn't abandon him, and he wouldn't have been left behind. That bond may have led them all into danger. The location itself raised questions. This was not a road anyone in their right mind would have chosen. It was remote, narrow, and led deeper into the mountains, away from civilization. In the middle of winter, driving that way without preparation was practically a death sentence. Searchers familiar with the region said plainly, "You don't go up there in February unless you're lost or looking for trouble." But that only deepened the puzzle. The car showed no signs of being forced or broken. Why had they stopped? Why leave a perfectly good vehicle behind when it offers shelter, warmth, and mobility? Theories began to swirl, spreading quickly from investigators to the community, and eventually to the wider public once the media picked up the story. The first theory was the most straightforward: accidental death due to exposure. Perhaps the young men had panicked after the car got stuck, or thought it was stuck, and decided to walk for help. In freezing temperatures, even strong men can lose clarity of thought. Hypothermia sets in, judgment becomes impaired, and people often make irrational decisions. This explanation seemed plausible, but it did little to account for why 5 men, responsible, grounded, and familiar with driving, would collectively abandon a safe, functioning vehicle. The second theory was darker: foul play or kidnapping. Some speculated the men had been forced from their car by another party. The open window suggested a hurried exit, or perhaps an attempt to talk to someone outside. Could they have been lured away, taken deeper into the woods by strangers? Yuba County wasn't known for violent crime, but in 1978, rumors traveled fast. Stories emerged of drifters, hunters, or even cult-like groups operating in the mountains. Nothing was substantiated, but the lack of logical explanation kept the whispers alive. The third theory suggested misadventure or psychological disorientation. Maybe one of the men, possibly Gary, convinced the others to take an unfamiliar road. Once night fell and snow began to cover their tracks, panic set in. Disoriented, cold, and scared, they might have decided to strike out on foot rather than risk waiting in the car. Survival experts call this irrational flight, a tendency, under stress, for people to abandon the very things that might keep them alive. To shed light, reporters consulted psychologists and survival experts. One psychiatrist interviewed in later years described the situation bluntly. Under extreme stress and in freezing conditions, human judgment collapses. People will take off their shoes, remove their jackets, even when it makes no sense. Disorientation becomes deadly. Another survival specialist explained how group dynamics can amplify poor decisions. If one person insists they know the way, others often follow, even if it means leaving behind safety. Loyalty, fear, and trust can override logic. But still, 5 men? Could all of them have made the same fatal choice? The lack of physical evidence around the car kept investigators guessing. No signs of a struggle, no tire tracks leading away except their own. No indication that anyone else had been there. And yet the sheer oddity of abandoning a working car in freezing conditions fueled suspicion of something more sinister. Local residents clung to their own theories. Some swore they'd seen the Mercury earlier on a different road, suggesting the men might have been chased. Others spoke of headlights weaving in strange patterns across the foothills that night, as if more than one vehicle was involved. The rumors grew, layering speculation on top of unanswered questions. The case had all the ingredients of a modern urban legend: 5 young men, a deserted car, and a mountain road that seemed to lead nowhere but into darkness. For law enforcement, the task was clear but daunting. Keep searching, keep questioning, keep hoping for evidence. For families, the questions were unbearable. Why didn't they stay in the car? What made them leave? Was someone else with them that night? Each theory, exposure, foul play, disorientation, had its merits. Each could explain part of the mystery, but none could explain it all. The abandoned Mercury stood as a silent witness, a riddle in metal and glass, challenging investigators to unlock its secrets. And as days turned into weeks, the search intensified, pulling in more resources, more speculation, and more dread. The car had been found, but the men were still missing. And in the frozen expanse of the Sierra Nevada, time was running out. By the time spring of 1978 arrived, the Sierra Nevada snow was beginning to retreat. The brutal winter that had swallowed up the Yuba County Five was finally over. For months, families had been living in limbo, suspended between hope and dread. Searchers had combed the mountains with dogs, helicopters, and snowmobiles, but the blizzards had made progress nearly impossible. Each day that passed chipped away at hope, but without the men's bodies, without answers, families still clung to the idea that maybe, somehow, the 5 were alive. It wasn't until June 4th, 1978, nearly 4 months after they vanished, that the first grim discovery was made. A group of motorcyclists exploring a rough logging road stumbled upon something they'd never forget. A small U.S. Forest Service trailer, deep in the woods, almost 20 miles from where the Mercury had been abandoned. Inside, the air was heavy, stale, and suffused with the unmistakable smell of decay. And there, laid out on a bed with neatly tucked sheets, was the body of Ted Wyer. Wyer had been a tall man, around 200 pounds when he disappeared. But by the time he was found, he had wasted away to little more than bones and skin. The coroner later estimated he had lost nearly half his body weight, starving slowly over the course of weeks. His beard growth suggested he had survived for nearly 13 weeks after the group went missing, meaning he endured through most of the spring, trapped and fading in that trailer. He had been wrapped in multiple layers of clothing, some of which belonged to the other men. His shoes were missing, and his feet were badly frostbitten. In the room, searchers also found dozens of unopened cans of sea-ration food, along with a working propane tank that could have provided heat. Yet Ted had never used them. Why? Was he too weak? Too confused? Or had he been waiting for someone else to return and help him? Not far from the trailer, searchers began finding more remains. In the woods, about 11 miles from the abandoned car, the bones of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were discovered. Their bodies were scattered and partially consumed by animals, making it difficult to determine exactly how they died. Their clothing suggested they had succumbed early, likely in the snow, disoriented and freezing, long before spring. A few days later, just off a trail between the trailer and the car, the remains of Jackie Hewitt were discovered. Jackie's bones were spread out, clothing shredded by the elements. He, too, had been lost to the cold and wilderness. But one man was still missing: Gary Mathias. Mathias's sneakers were found inside the trailer, suggesting that he had been there with Ted at some point. But his body was never found. To this day, no trace of him has ever been recovered. Some theorize that he wandered back into the woods trying to find help, and his remains were simply never located in the vast forest. Others whisper darker theories: that Gary escaped, somehow survived and simply vanished into another life. The fact that no remains were ever found keeps his story especially haunting. For the families, the discoveries were devastating. Each detail felt like a knife twist. The fact that Ted had lived for months alone in the cold trailer, that food and warmth had been within reach but left unused, that their sons, brothers, and friends had died so close to shelter. The grief was compounded by confusion. Why had they abandoned a working car with fuel still in the tank? Why had they walked deep into snow country with no survival gear? Why did Ted die surrounded by supplies that could have saved him? And why did Gary Mathias vanish without a trace, leaving only his shoes behind? Forensic reports offered little solace. The cause of death was consistent with exposure and starvation. No signs of foul play, no drugs or alcohol, just 5 young men, hopelessly out of place in a winter wilderness they never should have entered. But for the community, and especially for the families, these answers weren't enough. They were left with heartbreak, but also with endless, gnawing questions. The tragedy of the Yuba County Five wasn't just in the deaths themselves, but in the sheer senselessness of it all. The mountains had given back some of their secrets, but not all. Ted's lonely struggle, Jack and Bill's silent end in the snow, Jackie's scattered remains, and Gary's disappearance, each fragment only deepened the mystery. And in that silence, in those gaps where the truth should be, speculation began to grow. With the discovery of the bodies in June 1978, the case shifted from a frantic search and rescue mission into something darker, more puzzling. The Butte County Sheriff's Department officially oversaw the investigation, supported by the California Highway Patrol and the Forest Service. But despite the combined manpower, what unfolded was a case that often felt more like a riddle than an investigation. On paper, it was straightforward. 5 young men had become stranded in the mountains and died from exposure. But as detectives and coroners began piecing together the fragments, it became clear this was not a simple tragedy. Too many details didn't line up. Too many questions remained unanswered. The sheriff's office conducted interviews with family, friends, and locals. They retraced the men's last known steps from Chico to Oroville to the mountain roads where the Mercury Montego had been found. Investigators also mapped the sites of the bodies. Madruga and Sterling 11 miles from the car, Hewitt 12 miles away, and Wire in the trailer nearly 20 miles from the abandoned vehicle. Search teams returned repeatedly to the area, hoping to locate Gary Mathias's remains, but nothing was ever recovered. To this day, Gary is officially listed as a missing person. The case itself? Labeled a tragic accident and eventually closed. But for the families, and for the investigators who privately admitted their own doubts, closure never truly came. One of the first bizarre details that troubled investigators was geography. The men's Mercury had been found stuck on a remote logging road at 4,400 feet elevation. The car wasn't damaged. It wasn't out of gas. In fact, it started easily when officers later tested it. One window was left rolled down. So why abandon a perfectly functional vehicle in freezing conditions? From there, the men seemed to scatter. Madruga and Sterling collapsed roughly 11 miles south of the car, as if they had tried to walk for help and succumbed to the snow. Hewitt's remains were discovered a little farther along, his body scattered by animals. And Wire, most perplexing of all, ended up in a trailer 19 miles away. To put that into perspective, investigators estimated the hike from the car to the trailer would have required trudging through nearly 5 feet of snow in near-zero visibility. How did they get there without proper boots, supplies, or knowledge of the terrain? The trailer itself posed another mystery. When Wire's body was found, investigators noted that he had survived for weeks. His beard growth confirmed it. Around him were matches, wooden furniture that could have been burned for warmth, and a fully functional propane tank. There was even a locker stocked with dehydrated food, enough to keep several men alive for months. Yet none of it was used. The food remained sealed, the propane untouched, the furniture unburned. Instead, Ted Weir slowly wasted away, wrapping himself in clothing stripped from the others, lying in a bed until he died of starvation and exposure. Why? Investigators could never explain it. Some suggested mental impairment or fear of breaking into government property. Others argued he may have been waiting for someone else to return and help him. Snow tracks found during the initial search hinted at confusion. Early reports described footprints circling near the abandoned Mercury, almost as if the men had been pacing back and forth, unable to decide what to do. Some tracks led down toward the forest, others seemed to double back. Inconsistent, chaotic, and quickly covered by snow, the trail only suggested one thing: disorientation. Psychologists later speculated that panic and poor judgment under stress could have played a role. Most of the men had intellectual or mental health challenges that may have impaired decision-making. Gary Mathias, for example, suffered from schizophrenia and occasionally stopped taking his medication. Could paranoia or psychological distress have caused the group to abandon rational choices? The night they disappeared, a brutal storm swept through the Sierra Nevada. Snowfall was heavy, visibility was almost zero, and temperatures plunged below freezing. Even an experienced outdoorsman would have struggled in those conditions. For 5 men in street clothes, sneakers, and without survival gear, the odds were nearly impossible. Experts explained that hypothermia can quickly lead to confusion, irrational behavior, and even hallucinations. Victims often remove clothing, wander aimlessly, or fail to take obvious steps to survive. When combined with exhaustion and panic, the outcome is often fatal. The coroner's reports confirmed this pattern: exposure and starvation. But the sheer oddity of how close they were to supplies, to warmth, to survival, kept gnawing at everyone who examined the case. Even with these explanations, nothing tied together neatly. Why drive up a mountain road with no clear destination? Why walk miles into snowdrifts instead of back down to safety? Why ignore food and fuel in a trailer that could have saved them? And then there was Gary Mathias, the missing piece of the puzzle. His shoes in the trailer suggested he was alive with Weir at some point, but his body was never found. To this day, his absence fuels speculation. Did he wander farther into the wilderness and perish unseen? Or did he somehow escape and vanish into a new life? The investigation, though officially closed, left behind more questions than answers. Detectives admitted in private that it was one of the strangest cases they had ever handled. The files sit in archives now, cold as the mountains where the men lost their lives. The Yuba County Five case wasn't just about 5 men who got lost in the snow. It was about the contradictions, the oddities, and the failures of logic that defied explanation. A working car abandoned, food untouched, a propane tank never used, miles of brutal wilderness crossed by men with no equipment. To some, the tragedy can be explained by poor judgment, panic, and the merciless power of nature. To others, these details point to something darker, a mystery still waiting to be solved. And as the families learned to live with their grief, the community began to ask, was this truly a simple accident, or something far more sinister? Decades have passed since the Yuba County Five vanished into the Sierra Nevada mountains, but their story refuses to settle into history. For investigators, for families, and for armchair sleuths, the mystery still lingers like fog over the ridgeline. How could 5 men, with a working car and survival resources within reach, meet such strange and tragic ends? The official explanation, that they simply got lost and succumbed to exposure, feels unsatisfying. The details don't line up, and when details refuse to align, theories rush to fill the gaps. One theory, whispered almost from the beginning, suggested government involvement. The late 1970s were a time of public mistrust in authorities, and some speculated the men may have stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see. Perhaps illegal activity in the mountains, or even a secret military operation. Supporters of this theory point to the peculiar fact that the car was found so deep in a little-used logging road. Why there? Why that night? Could someone have lured them? Others took the speculation even further. Cult activity was rumored in Northern California during the 1970s, and some wondered whether the men crossed paths with a group performing rituals in the wilderness. The absence of Gary Mathias has fueled these rumors, with some insisting he was taken or joined willingly. And then there is the more folkloric idea of a curse, the curse of the Sierra. Mountain ranges, especially ones as vast and unforgiving as the Sierra Nevada, have long been seen as places where nature itself seems to conspire against intruders. Legends of disappearances, ghostly presences, and ill fortune abound. For locals, it was tempting to fold the Yuba County Five into that darker mythos. Of course, mysterious mountain tragedies aren't unique. Over the years, countless survival cases have ended in inexplicable decisions. Hikers found dead within sight of safety, pilots downed in snowstorms, their wreckage discovered decades later. The infamous Dyatlov Pass incident in the Soviet Union comes to mind. A group of skilled mountaineers who perished in bizarre circumstances, their deaths spawning conspiracy theories that persist to this day. But what sets the Yuba County Five apart is their sheer proximity to survival. In most tragedies, victims never come close to food, fire, or shelter. In this case, supplies were practically within reach, and yet the men either ignored them or failed to use them. That cruel irony has kept the case alive in the public imagination. Survival was possible, even likely, but something, fear, confusion, or perhaps something external, prevented them from grasping it. And then, of course, there is Gary Mathias, the missing man, the ghost in the story. Gary's shoes were found in the trailer where Ted Weir died, a chilling reminder that Gary made it at least part of the way. But his body was never recovered, despite extensive searches. Not a shred of clothing, no bones, no trace. That absence is like an open door that invites endless speculation. Some believe Gary survived. His military background and street smarts, they argue, gave him the best chance. Maybe he walked out of the mountains, started a new life under a new name. Over the years, rumors have surfaced of Gary sightings. In Canada, in Oregon, even in California towns not far from Yuba, none were ever confirmed. His relatives, though, never stopped wondering. His stepfather often said he believed Gary was still alive, wandering somewhere out there. Others in the family held on to hope but acknowledged his schizophrenia could have made survival alone nearly impossible. If he had lived, he would have needed medication. Medication he left behind that night. To investigators, the simplest explanation remains the most likely. Gary perished in the wilderness, his remains never found, perhaps carried away by animals or lost in terrain search teams couldn't reach. But even they admit the uncertainty gnaws at them. A missing person case is a wound that never heals. So what really happened to the Yuba County Five? Were they simply 5 unlucky men caught in a storm, victims of panic and poor judgment? Or did they stumble into something far stranger, an encounter that frightened them into abandoning reason? The truth may never be known. What we're left with are pieces. A car abandoned, a trail of footprints in the snow, bodies scattered miles apart, and a missing man who still haunts the story. For the families, the grief has softened with time but never disappeared. For investigators, the case is closed but never forgotten. And for the rest of us, the Yuba County Five remain a puzzle, a tragic story of survival so close, yet forever out of reach. For every headline about the Yuba County Five, there were families living in the shadows of loss. Mothers, fathers, siblings, each left with questions that no investigation could answer. When the car was first discovered, still sitting silent in the snow, the families clung to hope. Maybe the boys had wandered, maybe they were cold, but surely they'd be found alive. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and that hope was tested again and again. When the bodies were eventually discovered, the grief was staggering. Jack Madruga's mother later said her son would never have left the car. She couldn't understand how Jack, cautious, loyal, always sensible, ended up deep in the forest. For her, it was as if she had lost him twice, once when he vanished, and again when the explanation never came. Ted Weir's family faced an especially cruel heartbreak. Ted was found in the trailer, stretched out on a bed, wrapped in layers of blankets. He had survived the longest, clinging to life for weeks, perhaps even months. His family wondered, why hadn't he used the food nearby? Why hadn't help come sooner? For Ted's mother, the thought of him slowly fading alone haunted her for the rest of her life. And then there was Gary Mathias, the one who was never found. His stepfather said he often believed Gary was still alive, that maybe he had wandered into a new life somewhere. Others in the family weren't so sure, but the lack of closure was its own torment. Every phone call, every stranger's face in a crowd, could ignite a flicker of possibility. That kind of uncertainty is its own prison. Bill Sterling's family endured a quieter grief. His remains were never fully identified, leaving them with only fragments of an answer. For them, the tragedy was compounded by invisibility. Bill's story, his life, often overshadowed by the mystery itself. Kathy, Jack Hewitt's sister, once described the loss as a hole that never closes. She remembered her brother's laughter, his small joys, sports, friends, family dinners. To her, he wasn't part of a mystery or a theory. He was simply her little brother, stolen by a mountain night. What unites all these families is not just the tragedy, but the silence left behind. They asked for answers, and the answers never came. They asked for peace, and instead they were given theories, speculation, and whispers of conspiracy. To this day, the grief remains deeply personal. Beneath the sensational headlines and chilling details, 5 families were left shattered. And in the quiet moments, away from the spotlight, their stories remind us of the human cost of unsolved mysteries.